Hello and welcome to Classics Confidential. I'm Anastasia and I'm delighted to welcome Gesine again to CC. So Gesine, today we're going to be talking about Neo-Latin. Can you tell us first of all, what is Neo-Latin?
I'm not surprised that you're asking, because it's something that's not yet very well known, but it's a huge amount of Latin literature from the Renaissance and Humanist period, and that's why we call it Neo-Latin, which is a fancy term for New Latin, and that's to distinguish it from the Latin of the classical period, which you would normally learn if you were doing a Latin course, so the Latin that was spoken by Cicero or Virgil in the 1st century BC and AD. And then that carries on until the period which we call Late Antiquity in the 4th to 6th centuries. And then you move into the Middle Ages, where you have medieval Latin. And medieval Latin has its own development because it still developed as a language in relationship to the vernaculars, and you have a lot of constructions and words that you don't find in classical Latin and would even be ungrammatical in classical Latin. And then at the end of the medieval period, when we move into the Renaissance period, and about, depending on the country, in around 1400 or a little later, then you have the humanists who deliberately look back to the classical period. That's obviously why it's called the Renaissance. And they are taking up all the traditions from the classical period and writing Latin again in the traditional style. Obviously, they can't deny that they're living in a different period and they refer to Queen Elizabeth or other contemporary figures in Latin, but their style is again much more like classical Latin, and the metaphors or images they use. And for a long time people haven't really looked at this Renaissance Latin, which we now call Neo-Latin, because first of all it falls in between all disciplines, and classicists like myself for a long time stopped in late antiquity and didn't really regard this modern Latin as part of their job, whereas people in history or English who work on this period looked at the text and the vernacular and didn't really look at the Latin. And then also a lot of this material, it hasn't been edited. I mean, if you go to the British Library, you'll find lots of early prints in Latin, but no one has really worked on them or edited them, so they're not easily accessible. But there's a huge amount of material, not all of the same interest and the same quality, but a lot of things that are very interesting in terms of both for the period and also in the way in which classical material was received at the time.
That's really exciting. And also we have a case study that you're working on in Scotland, which is sort of very close to us. So why do you think Scottish poets decided to write in Latin?
For the same reason, to a certain extent, that people of that time in other European countries also wrote in Latin. That was still the language of the educated people, the language of the church or of official business, and also like English today, it was the international language. So if you wanted your work to be read outside England or Scotland, you would write it in Latin. And there are also cases where things that were first written in English were translated into Latin, so that people on the continent could read them. Another reason might be that Scottish writers in particular were very well travelled. Lots of them studied on the continent or had relations to the continent, so they were also obviously quite keen for their work to be received there, and a lot of Scottish works have also been printed on the continent, and they had grown up in these traditions. So that was the language of choice. And that's not to say that there was only Latin literature in Scotland at the time. There was also literature in English and in Scottish. But it was a kind of third language that was widely used, but, and as I said before, until a short while ago, that wasn't really recognized. There's as much Scottish literature in Latin in that period than in other languages.
How fascinating. So can you tell us of one particular poet that you're working on that perhaps has something really interesting to say?
I got involved with Scottish Neo-Latin because of a project that's going on there, because there is kind of anthology of Scottish Neo-Latin writing, which was established in the early 17th century. So there was an idea to collect sort of the choice bits of Scottish Neo-Latin writing that had been written up to this point. And in a very small volume, it's only just like this, and printed in Amsterdam, but it contains like hundreds of pages of Neo-Latin literature, and some of it is not available elsewhere, and so there's currently a project going on in Scotland to edit at least part of it, sort of transcribe it, translate it, make it available online so that people have access to this material. I mean, they can't do the whole thing because it would be too much, but at least some of it, which is not easily accessible elsewhere, they're going to edit. And that's why I started to learn about Scottish Neo-Latin literature. And one poet I've worked on is called Johnston, and for instance he's written a cycle of poems on cities, which is a classical concept. You find examples of that at least in late antiquity, if not earlier. But he has written poems about Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews, about all these towns, and then describing, each poem is about sort of 20 to 30 lines long, and he tells you about the main buildings, the main rivers in the area, and obviously he doesn't just say the River Clyde is in Glasgow, but he uses a kind of paraphrases and metaphor in the classical style. And on the one hand it's just a description of the city, but on the other hand he also gives you an idea of life in the city and alludes to the kind of political and religious complications in Scotland at the time. So you can either read it as a sort of quite nice description of a city, but if you read between the lines, you also get a lot to know about the historical situation at the period. And this is an example of something I said at the beginning. They use Latin, they use the meter and the poetical form, they use the metaphors and images, but they talk about something that is relevant in their own time or where they live, and that's what it makes it quite interesting to see the tension between the two things.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you very much, Gesine, for talking with us, and also very best of luck with the project.
Thank you very much, my pleasure.